guess we're going to treat this very, very informal, to be honest. And I think we're doing it very intentional. The first reason is that freelancing does not have to be formal. One of the reasons that I personally love it is because I can dress like this and earn more money than if I worked at a large tech company. So very intentionally, we do not want to sit here and just grill you for 10 hours about a very, very boring presentation. Also, Alina, thank you for putting us after John Younger and some of the great data. And so we also don't have to spit out facts to you. We can just say, hey, the data's there. Deeper than any of the data is the fact that people actually care enough to do the data. So Microsoft is releasing a massive report. Obviously, you saw John Younger's report. Even in 2014, Stanford invested a bunch of money to look at this space. So deeper than any stat, the fact that there are large organizations putting money to this, having their employees focus on this, the proof's in the pudding just in that in itself. There was in the US, I think it was over $1.2 trillion spent on us freelancers in the past year. That stat I love because it shows, hey, there's serious dollars. But we are going to literally just look at these questions. Why can't I click? Here we go. We're going to use these questions as a base. But before we do that, Matt, do you want to kick off a little background on yourself in terms of why you even care about freelancing and what your life has looked like up until now?
Sure. Yeah. And I come at it from a bit of a different angle. So I am one of those, corporate types that have spent most of my career in organizations of some fashion or another. I've done everything from a handful of startups up to, 30, 40,000 person organizations. And I found freelancing and sort of got into it a couple of different ways. One was to scratch some creative itches that I had. So I was doing sort of the corporate thing and it worked well for me, but I needed an outlet. I'm a creative type. I love to write, love to do music and art and all these other kinds of things. And so it was an opportunity. And that's actually how I met Matt. So we co-authored a report together and then ended up writing a book and doing all sorts of other fun stuff. What I have found, so I've been in, as I mentioned, more of sort of the corporate executive IT space, and we've seen a transition. There's always been subcontractors and consultants that you would bring in to do certain types of work. But what I've seen is over the last couple of decades, that has skyrocketed in terms of bringing in third-party talent. And then I'm starting to see organizations that are very tried and true, sort of traditional industries start to leverage freelancers as well. And everything from financial institutions, banks, to manufacturing and other types of companies. So it's really becoming mainstream, and we'll talk a lot more about that. So yeah.
Perfect.
Matt, you want to jump in on the first one?
So there's a couple of you I think already know me. I saw Jasmine and Camila. Great to see you on the thread. But sort of my background is freelancer at my core. I did the traditional path at first, but I actually started freelancing in college, and I was doing a lot of management consulting. And so my sort of life is always three things. I freelance to make money. I then usually either help companies hire freelancers at scale, and then I go start a company and I lose all my money, but thank God I know how to freelance, so I'm freelancing all throughout it. So sort of my background is I've seen freelance happen at scale. What I mean by that is we're talking $1 million projects happening through freelancers, not sort of one-off gigs that are happening through Fiverr, but how do you fundamentally transform an organization through freelancers? So everything from, we have a story in the book where North America's largest motorcycle manufacturer built out their digital rider experience by having 20 plus freelancers all around the globe. Most recently, I was at Microsoft helping our customers spend up to $100 million on us. So this is not a cute little flash in the pan, but it's been kind of fun to watch, because when I started freelancing, my parents thought I was an Uber driver and everyone thought I threw my career away. And so it's been very, very fun, literally in the past 5 years, to see this industry go from we're these rebels that can't get a job to everyone wanting to hire us. So I guess let's kick it off, Matt. And what do you think work looks like in 10 years?
Yeah, this is great timing, because we just did an interview with a guest last week that was he is a project management consultant, has run his own business, wrote a book, several books on the topic, and so forth. And he was quoting some forecasts from project management professionals, sort of the Harvard Business School folks, that said that by 2030, so 10 years from now, that 80% of all work will be project-based. So letting that sing 80%. So it means 80% of the effort, 80% of the value that a company is creating is project-based, which is no surprise. But basically the point is that all of the administrative, operational, sort of day-to-day work will be largely automated, streamlined away. And what will be left is project. So that was one of the big, not super novel realizations, but it just puts a finer point on just how quickly we've jumped from traditional work to project-based. And that means virtual teams, freelance as part of that mix.
I love it. And oh crap. And so from my end, and everyone out there too, feel free to put into the chat what you think your answers are, or if you have any questions as well. So this is super, super collaborative. So sort of from my lens is, listen, I think COVID accelerated this question immensely. If we were talking 2 years ago, the 10 years would kind of look like what I think now is going to happen in 2 to 5 years. And at its core, it's really all about this. Companies are turning to us from a strategic perspective. It used to be when they wanted things cheap, they would turn to freelancers, or if they were in a serious oh shit moment, they would turn to us. But this was very, very fringe. Now we have made it into the strategic planning, meaning when companies are doing budgeting season and figuring out how they want to invest their resources, they're actually looking at us. Now there's some major, major implications. So for us as freelancers, the number one implication is that we have to grow up. And what I mean by that is we can no longer be freelancers. We actually have to go win budgets over agencies. So it's not a, hey, let's just go give money to freelancers. It's a, let's give money to a better alternative than the agencies. So the agencies are too expensive. Like at its core, that's what's happening, is that the agencies, their dollar point, it's too high. But if the experience is bad, they're going to keep going to the agencies. So that's the number one thing for you as freelancers that I see as the major sort of worry, is that we need to beat the agencies. In terms of other things, in terms of getting it really, really tangible, fervent belief that companies will be 80% elastic. Now, freelance might be the word we use, gig might be the word that we use. I don't know what it's going to be. We use the term human cloud because it encompasses everything, but at least 80% of companies will be elastic, meaning it won't be full-time people working on the same team. With that said, remote is obviously a huge factor. So companies are not going to be 100% remote. Some great companies might be, like Automatic and WordPress, but it's definitely not going to be the norm. And if you look at large companies, they've invested trillions of dollars into their headquarters. So that's not going to go away overnight. And there's also great things about the office. So similar to companies not being 100% freelancers, even though now we have the, what's it called? The DAOs, Matt, that we had to talk about in the show a couple of weeks ago, the decentralized autonomous organizations. Cute. I don't see it happening, to be honest, at scale in the next 5 years. It sounds like a classic Silicon Valley hype train that's cute for academics, but not actually practical for normal people. But so in terms of what does the world look like in 10 years, good news, it's going to be heavily, heavily freelance. It's also going to be heavily, heavily remote, but it's not only going to be just freelance or just remote, and it is going to require us as leaders, meaning we're freelance leaders, we're not just freelancers. It's going to require us to actually go beat those agencies. So
Matt,
yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I want to chime in on the agency point, because we talked a bit about that with Louise from Hello Moss, and there is a play to beat them based only on price, because agencies have a lot of overhead. So that is one factor. You will come in cheaper than the agencies just by the fact that you don't have huge overhead. But that's not the only. Like, I don't think that's your only competitive advantage. The other that speaks to me is when you're working with an agency or a consulting company, the person that is selling the business is rarely the person delivering the business. So you have they come in and they have someone who's the expert that's really good at explaining something. And then you get the B team that comes in and implements it. With freelance, it's the same person. So you have that expertise that you bring to bear, and you can demonstrate, I am going to be the one doing this work. So if you like me, you like what I'm presenting, then you'll know what you get. And that is that's a big difference. And as a hirer of contingent workforce through consultants and so forth, I see that play out in real life. But I wanted to, so Jasmine had a great question about what does the long-term impact mean for companies with remote work. And she mentioned, cultural, office environment, DEI, and so forth. Matt, you want to, I thought I'd take a stab at that, and you can as well. This is so I'm currently a CIO at a large law firm in the US. It's a professional services organization. And this is the very conversation we have in our, executive committee meetings weekly. So I'd love to drill in on this. Matt, what are your thoughts first?
Okay, so Jasmine, I know you're sitting in Singapore. So the analogy I'm going to use is, I think it's not that different than the expat package. And for those sitting out there, what I mean by the expat package is, if you go to Singapore, what is it, Jasmine? It's like 12 million people and 4 million Singaporeans, and the rest are expats. And there can be a stark difference between what the expats get and what the locals. Yeah, less than 6 million. Yeah, so there can be a stark difference between what the expats get and what the locals get. Now, the expat package, I didn't have it, but it's sweet. Like, the expats that I did meet, they were living a very, very good life that they could have never lived in the US. And I think it's a similar thing with remote work, where you have people who are making so much more money than the local populations, and it can be terrifying. So I'm sitting here in Miami. We have a bunch of remote workers coming from San Francisco and New York. Miami as a city doesn't have a middle class, and is significantly cheaper than most places in the US. That's changed literally within 1 year. Also, when I went to Bali, and Jasmine, I don't know if you've been before, but I went to Bali expecting like an authentic Indonesian experience, and it was all Australians and British people. I was like, what the hell? So I think there has been this I would argue it's a pretty toxic wave of remote work, where you have a bunch of wealthy Westerners going into areas that are, culturally authentic, and just destroying the place in terms of raising the prices, having the locals become service workers, and definitely not being good for the community in terms of the local people. In terms of DEI in the office, that one, I'm not too sure. I need to see more data on that for sure. And I think in terms of the office environment, I personally hate the office, but I didn't grow up in the office, so I don't understand what's good about it. To me, when I was in an office, someone would come into your room every 13 minutes and just ruin your flow. And so I told Microsoft, I'm going to be remote first. And if if we don't hit our numbers, then great, I'll do whatever you want. But until then, no way in hell I'm coming into the office for most of my time. So my general is from a remote working, like in terms of communities, I think it's pretty scary. I think that if not done with controls, it can totally ravish countries that are not of the same income bracket. But what's your take, Matt?
Yeah. All of that plus. So I do come from a number of industries that are a bit more traditional and have, large office presences and large expenses that are tied to those offices that they're not necessarily willing to let go of. And the tricky thing here in the US is the pandemic happened right as we were on a tear, and still are in some ways, of rather economic growth. So I know a number of companies, including a prior employer of mine, that spent millions of dollars expanding their office space just in time to send everybody home. And so there will be, I think, a financial incentive to get people back in the office and utilize that space. There's no way to avoid that. The DEI conversation is really important, and I have found it from the office perspective, it cuts both ways. And what I mean by that is that in a law firm, for instance, I've heard a lot from associates, particularly women and minority associates, that say they get more face time now with the client on a Zoom meeting than they did when they were in the office, because one, the partner is just another square on a Zoom meeting, so they can't monopolize the conversation. It's also easier to invite more people into the conversation when it's virtual. You don't have the optics of you're in a conference room with 2 clients and 5 attorneys, for instance. So that is a positive. And we're seeing in the industry a lot of resistance from associates to go back to the old way of doing things. But Matt and I actually talked quite a bit about this, there is an assumption that everybody has a dedicated workspace, high-speed internet, childcare is covered in these types of things. And that we just know that's not true for a lot of people. So we do worry that, and have seen statistics that this remote work is impacting negatively those that don't have the economic means to facilitate a remote work experience. And that is a concern of ours. So I've seen companies, and this back to the point of culture and DI, I've seen companies investing in home office setups, remote work stipends, those types of things to let people buy the equipment they need, providing childcare credits or childcare advice. And so there's this, I think there is a corporate and social safety net that can be wrapped around this to lessen some of the worst impacts of remote work on those that it's not an ideal situation for. So yeah, I think it is a mixed bag. And if I think far enough out, I've always referred to companies as sort of a hub and a spoke. So think of a wheel. The hub is that core corporate culture. It's the core foundation of the organization. And then you've got all of these spokes that are going around it doing different kinds of work. And those are our projects. And what's happened over time is the hub is shrinking and the spokes, the projects are becoming much more frequent. And but so it's all the more important to get that hub right, because if you don't have that cohesion, then it becomes much harder to ensure that that the culture spreads across the various different groups working on projects. And it's going to be harder with remote work initially, Matt, I think, but it's a skill that we all will learn over time to work remote and hybrid, and it gets better. It gets easier. I've been doing it for 20 years now.
And I would add, Matt, to that. So one thing for you all, what I love is this is a very, very globally distributed community. And it's something that's very, very important. But there's one thing that we're actually hyper worried about, talk about a lot on the show, that's very, very recent, and that's US inflation. So for those that don't see US news, we're about to probably have the highest inflation we've ever had as a country. Some of the prices that you're seeing are out of this world insane. And so I'm interested to see how that impacts globally. And the reason for that is what I've seen from a lot of friends, quite frankly, and a lot of companies, is that we're giving out 10% pay increases to adjust for inflation. And the worry is that if the US has massive inflation and we increase all our wages and then our remote workers go and live outside of the US, well, that's very artificially inflated. So now we're going to pump up the prices of every other country because we can't take care of our own shit here in the US. And so that's one thing to be, I'd say, hyper worried about. A second thing that you freelancers, we need to take a stance on in terms of an industry is, do we want to be paid based off of our local wages or based off of what the company thinks is a good price? That's something that as an industry, we've been dealing with for 20 plus years, and there's never been an answer. And honestly, you can understand both sides, because if you're saying you're going to pay someone in a developing country and you're going to pay them higher local wages, well, that's actually really good for them. But then is it good when you have the same people doing the same work, but one person's getting paid 1/10 the cost? I don't know. So I don't know what the solution is, but as an industry, we freelancers do need to have a stance on this and start to work together. And to Matt's point about the hub and the spoke, when you look at the way things used to look, it used to be large organizations and we were kind of on the fringe and we had no power. Now it's totally opposite. We have the power and companies are freaking out about us. When I say we, I don't even mean just freelancers, I mean us top talent. So sorry to burn the mood of inflation, but it's something that's very, very top of mind here in the US. And
I imagine elsewhere also. Yeah, I imagine it either in the countries you're in, you've already been wrestling with inflation for the past, decade, or you are now. I don't think anybody's escaping it right now. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Matt, why, and this next question is very relevant because we had Preston Mossman over at Coke Industries. And just for all your backgrounds out there, sort of my own freelancing is actually helping corporate leadership how to hire freelancers at scale. So this question is very, very sort of hard to me. But Matt, how would you summarize why companies turn to freelancers?
Yeah, well, it's we talk about a burning platform. If a company's using their existing full-time employees to full capacity and they don't have any extra demand and everything's going fine, then they likely won't turn to freelancing. So they turn to freelancers when they have a problem that needs solved and they can't solve it in the traditional way. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. And it is partly the labor shortage, labor demand, great resignation, however you'd like to call it, that's been happening for decades. They just decided to put a label on it now. Companies are increasingly having a difficult time hiring and retaining good talent in the long term. And Matt, we joked with Preston, he's been, I think, at Coke Industries for maybe 7 years. My record is 5 years. I usually about 3 to 5 years at a role. Matt, you're like, if it's a year, I've been there too long. You feel
2
like
years.
a dinosaur.
Hey,
2
2
years.
2 years.
All right.
I can make it 2
But
years.
But I
That's
think
it.
it's this generational shift where you just don't see, and it happened even back in the 90s and 2000s with tech roles, you just don't see people staying in the same organization forever. And that's a trend that is continuing. It's becoming more and more accelerated. And so what you have is a company that's saying, I'm spending a third to a half of an annual salary to hire and train people that will stay here for a year. The economics just don't make sense. So then they turn to consultants. Same thing. The economics aren't making sense because they're paying 30, 40, 50% overhead on those rates because of the agency's background and operations. And so, yeah, I mean, freelancers solve a need both in terms of the economics, but also on the delivery, because more and more talent, top talent, is moving into that space. I will say, and this is something that is new, is the biggest problem with hiring independent workers that aren't through a consulting agency is all of the bureaucracy or administration that comes with that. It's the background checks, it's the financial checks, it's security and compliance. It's all of those things that benefits everything that a company has to do to work with an individual. If it takes you 3 to 4 weeks to onboard someone to do 5 hours of work, it just is not going to work. So there are platforms, and Matt, you know much more about them than I do, but there are platforms out there that basically serve as a broker for freelancers without taking the huge cut that a traditional agency would, because they're leveraging technology. And I see Jasmine, about AI and machine learning and chatbots and such. They're using the technology to help with the matching and the onboarding, as opposed to a person doing all of that.
That's what's changed the most, by the way. So it used to be that when I would go to a conference or a happy hour, like all of us could fit in a room. And now there's a new platform owner or a new solution literally every single day. We've hit like a year now. So there's a lot of people that I can say, okay, they're gone. But that's been a huge change, is that our little room that used to be just a couple of us has now turned into everywhere. There's yeah.
Okay, we got to riff on this for a second, Matt, because it just made me think. So I'm dating myself. Yes, I'm the older Matt. 25 years ago or so, not quite that long, about 20 years ago, I presented a paper at an international conference on data mining. So this was one of the preeminent machine learning conferences.
Boy.
I actually got to go to Japan, and my university paid for it. It was awesome. So I presented a paper there to the world's data mining. There were 30 people in the audience. Like in the entire conference, there were 30 people. Quite a bit more today, right? So we are seeing that there's these mega trends, and people and there's so much hype and all that and buzz around it. But when you just look about the sheer number of people that are entering the space and the investment and the energy, it's no wonder that we're seeing this uptick in both freelancing and in AI.
Yeah, for sure. And so for this question, so the two things that I usually hear, and this is, I'll go even pre-COVID, it's access to experts that they couldn't have, specifically access to skills that were too hard to find for full time, and within an agency, they didn't know who was doing the work. So access to skills, but then also the speed to execution. And so hiring a freelancer takes in corporate language, takes 1 to 5 days. Getting an agency takes 30 to 65 days. Full-time takes 3 to 6 months. So the raw sort of boring KPIs was that it's better, it's faster, and it's more cost efficient. Now that it was like the boring corporate language. Come COVID, because of the labor shortage and the great resignation, like Matt mentioned, this is now in strategic planning. So it used to be that it would be a very, very weird, ambitious leaders. And this always happens in technology. So the fringe leaders were the ones that would take the stance on hiring freelancers. And they would get in a lot of corporate trouble because what they were doing actually wasn't within corporate policy, and they could get in a lot of trouble. So they would start by using their corporate card, they would show results, and then they would be the trailblazers that were taking the program by the baton. And there's a lot of great ones out there, and within a lot of large companies. You won't see most of them because PR and legal and HR make sure that they stay silent, but there is a lot of them within these large companies. The difference is now it's HR and it's procurement that is taking a stance and saying, okay, we need to hire elastic talent. So that's the major difference that you all are seeing today. And to be honest, like, we actually didn't really influence any of this. It was mostly the fact that COVID exposed that 99% of work could be done remote. No one wants to go to work and no one's staying at work for more than 6 months. So we've actually kind of benefited from a wave that we didn't expect that is just huge. And so we just keep on doing what we're doing. So those are the two major things, though. In terms of if you're wondering why in the world clients love you, it's usually access to expertise that they wouldn't have if they had to hire you full time, and also speed to execution. So I wonder, Matt, should we even answer this why is top talent? Because you all know, right? And it's all different. What we learned, just to give you guys a background too, over the past year, we worked with 300 freelancers very, very intensely, and we're very select with those freelancers. What we learned with this question, it's all over the place, to be honest. Like every freelancer has a different answer. And there is a little bit of commonalities, like we all love choice, we all love freedom, we all love control. But this question is kind of all over the place. We all have different answers. Matt, have you noticed any trends within the research of a book or those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I have, and it's part of that is that freedom of choice and control, sort of the not having a boss. We joke that a lot of freelancers and consultants before them were unemployable. So it's, well, this is the route I'm going to take because I can't stand to work in a corporate structure. That's one, but I do think there is a lot of people that move into freelance either because they were sort of forced into that decision, or because their circumstances really required flexibility, whether it was caring for an aging parent or helping with child rearing, as I have done, things of that nature. So there was a lot of different more practical reasons. A lot of times what I've seen is, for those that came out of a corporate life, it was they were laid off, they were sort of forced out, or their contract expired for a project they were on and they had to roll off. But then they were able to say, well, I have these skills, let me just go ahead and start doing that on the side, or as a side hustle, or however you want to call it, and then pivoting that into a freelance career. Matt, and I think that we've talked about this, the generation before you all, there was a place for this, and they were consultants and you entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call them, but they had their own business. They often traded on expertise, and in essence, they were freelancers. But the difference was, Matt, you pointed out, it was local. They were expected to be in the office of the company they were consulting for. It was very much physically network driven. So it was all word of mouth through physical presence. And that's what has changed with this remote work surge, is they don't need to do that anymore. You can be anywhere in the world and still provide that same level of service.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree more. Let us know if there's any questions in the chat related to this. I think you all know better than us this question. So let's dive into this last one, which I think is the most important, to be honest, for all of us. I want to make sure that I stress, like, we're not doing this alone. I know as freelancers, it can feel like we're all on an island unto ourselves, and we can feel like it's our business, right? And there's no other outside forces. But the reality is, the decisions that you make have an impact on the whole industry. So if you are willing to work lower prices and lowball, guess what? You're contributing to the race to the bottom, which is a major, major problem in our industry. If you are ghosting clients, guess what? You're contributing to the fact that agencies might be easier. So you are contributing to the problem of the freelance economy. So I want to make sure that we have a context that we are all in this together. This is not something that we're all a bunch of individuals, even though it can feel like that at times. So in terms of what's in the way of the freelance economy, the number one thing that I want to highlight is just raw change management. And the reason I say that is because clients don't know how to work with you. Clients have not been trained on how to hire freelancers, and procurement and HR brochures or pamphlets or standard operating procedures don't yet say this is how to work with freelancers. So it's the wild, wild west. The client doesn't know how to work with you. And most likely you haven't had significant account management experience. If you have, hell yes, help that freelancer out next to you about how to work that. But most likely you're not freelancing because you want to be a manager. So with that said, the number one problem that I see is freelancers not managing expectations. So what I mean by that is that as a client, we don't care how much it is and how long it's going to take. What we really care about is predictability, stability, and consistency. We need to know what's going to get done by when. And if it doesn't get done, you need to tell us ASAP, because we have someone over us generally that your work is going to get us fired if it doesn't get done. So managing expectations is by far the number one skill that we've seen contribute to a successful project. What does that mean? That means from the second that you first talk to that person, to the second that you send over an invoice, to the second that you send over a weekly status update, or you finish the project, that client knows what's going on, what's going to happen, and that what they are going to receive is above their expectations. Now, there's little ways to do this, but the very, very best ones that I've seen is making sure you always have a comparable and making sure that you're professional in your relationships. There's numerous ways to go about it, but that's the most important thing that I've seen, is managing expectations. In the background, and Matt, this is where you know better than anyone else in the world, there are a lot of technical challenges that we just have to sort of allow to evolve. Some of these technical challenges are the fact that if you're a developer, a company might not be able to work with you. I kind of joke, but it's actually not a joke. I've had to put laptops underneath my shirt, but in my bag, and go through customs, because guess what? It's still really hard to work with you. Companies might need their own laptops. They might need virtual desktoping. They might need virtualization. There's different solutions that are kind of beyond our control. But there is some basics that you do need to know about. And the two ones that always come to mind and always come within leadership discussions is security and compliance. So compliance is literally just, are you going to get them in trouble for hiring a freelancer? There's massive implications. If they're hiring you, and this is countrywide, but each country has their unique specifics. If they're hiring you as a freelancer, but they should have hired you as a full-time employee, what you need to know is that they might need back taxes, and they might get in trouble for not giving you benefits. This is actually a great question about how the government responds. We'll make sure we hit on that. So compliance, and then security is just, how do they know you're not going to steal their stuff? What you need to know about that is, if they go through an agency, they have someone to sue. You as freelancers, you can't sue you. Not because you might not have money, but you probably don't have enough money, and it's not worth it for them to go after a bunch of individuals. So the security question is not a, how do you make sure that you are secure? The question is, the base of it in the back end is, they need to make sure they have someone to sue. And even if they know they're not going to, they just need to show that they have that potential. So I'll stop it there. Matt, is there, what do you want to add to that in terms of being in the way?
No, I mean, yeah, yes, you're absolutely right. When it boils down, both security and compliance, and then some of the other aspects around, HR, background check, all that kind of stuff, is it's risk mitigation. And the biggest challenge right now is when you're engaging in an individual, it's just what you said, like, you don't have a lot of recourse if something goes poorly. And that is why many larger companies, particularly regulated organizations, still go with an outfit that they know they can sue. And there's insurance and liability and those types of things. So I do think there is, and to the point about governments, there needs to be support structures for the freelancers when it comes to benefits and to a steady income stream, or being able to manage things like mortgages and insurance payments and things like that when you don't have a steady income stream. On the corporate side, I think there is an opportunity to find some way of, again, aggregating freelancers to give them these kind of protections, to give them liability insurance and things like that, without having to go to the extreme of having a large agency. So there is a middle ground there. And I'll give, lawyers are a great example. I mean, I work in large law firms, but in the US at least, I don't know how it is in other countries, but there are tens and tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of individual practitioner lawyers. And they have, through their bar associations, through their legal associations, they can buy liability insurance. So they're just as protected as the next attorney, but they have that safety net. So freelancer unions, those types of things, big thumbs up on those. I think they're heading in the right direction. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, cooperatives. So I think that will help solve some of the challenges. When it comes to companies hiring, if you take those out of the equation, I think that we're getting closer. I don't think there's much left structurally that's an impediment to bringing on freelancers in companies now, and that's exciting, because it was 5-10 years ago, it was much, much more difficult.
So this
Yeah.
last question from you, Allison, which is a great question, is what do governments need to do to respond to these changes in the way people work? Matt, I'll let you start with this one because my answer, especially in the US here, is kind of get the hell out of the way. And this comes down to like, what do we think what are your personal government beliefs? The US, we're very hands off. We don't really do vacation too well. We kind of work a little bit too hard probably. But so I just want to make sure there is individual opinions here. But Matt, you go first because you have a much more clear, concise political way to answer this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, government is all about providing guardrails along the road so you don't veer off into a cliff. It is intended to be that true safety net, and that probably gives a bit of a sense of my political leaning. But I do think that governments can help by providing some of those assurances and protections so that people can go and choose the work that is most meaningful for them and the way to work that's most meaningful for them, and that they have the backing of the government, so sort of support structures. And so I do think that revamping of, again, here in the US, at least, health insurance for sure is a problem on many, many levels, but solving for that and solving for some form of universal health insurance, maybe portable health insurance is a good way to think about it. But I think broader than that, it's governments need to catch up with where the state of the industry is, because Matt, you've seen it. And I know when we talked with Glenn about EU policies, same thing. The governments they don't even understand what this is, let alone how to help. And so the first part is going to be education. And that needs to happen now. We're already about 10 years past when we needed them to understand what this is. Yeah, what you think, Matt?
Well, so to your last point, I'll start last first. To your last point of government understanding this technology, I mean, we have a president that's like 78 years old, and we have senators that are so old. And so I think that's kind of a problem when your grandparents are the ones in power. Just generally, I'm always having to teach my aunt who's 70 how to use her iPhone. So I don't know, maybe that's a little bit too mean, but I think that is a problem. The fact that our people in the US, at least, are so damn old. With that said, I think globally, and especially US, that government's been built around full-time jobs, at least for the past 150 years. It's been built around the Industrial Revolution. It's been built around factory jobs, and we took the factory and we turned it into an office park. So there's been an assumption that if you want good benefits, if you want good health insurance, it has to come through the full-time job. And from a government lens, sort of this past actually couple of years, I've been fortunate to have some visibility into this. It's actually really helpful if government only has a couple of large companies, because it's very easy to slap regulations, slap penalties than it is to slap penalties on over 60 million distributed freelancers. So I think structurally, there's a massive challenge that is larger than what any individual can do. And that is we've been built around the full-time job. With that said, there are some initiatives that are being used currently in government. I know in the UK, IR35 is going pretty strong. In the US, we have this thing called the PRO Act. And I'm not too sure, globally how this part works, but I know in the US, our unions are very powerful. So our union membership has declined an immense level, but they still got a lot of money. And so the PRO Act is union funded. And what the PRO Act does say is that overnight, over 60 million freelancers would be forced to be full-time workers. And the reason for that, the cynical reason, the government needs to get their tax money, specifically the payroll tax, and they need to fund these massive things they have coming ahead. So in terms of what government can do, this is where I'm, just to be honest, a little more libertarian in terms of get the hell out, because us freelancers, we don't really need that much. We just need people to usually get out of our way. I think there's a lot of great solutions that are coming to front. So there's a healthcare solution called IndiePop. There's one called Stuvo. There is plenty of entrepreneurs that are focusing on this space, specifically in the fintech, the banking, and the health insurance space. I personally trust those more than I do a government to catch up.
Well, Matt, I think that where government needs to understand better what this looks like and start to adapt to this different way of work that is not an industrial era way of working, education the same way. Absolutely. So education needs to be reformed as well. And again, not torn down completely, but needs to be remade in the image of what a information worker and a freelancer needs. So I think we'll get there. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but governments and education, they'll be slow to get there, but they will ultimately get there, more painfully and longer than we'd like. But yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah. And one last call out here is, I think as an industry, we have to look at incentives. I think that's one of the hardest part in industry has been that a lot of the incentives are counterintuitive. So the incentive of a freelance platform is to have more clients. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're for the better of each individual freelancer. The incentives of an individual freelancer are different than the freelance platform, and the incentives of a company are different than the freelance platform and the freelancer. So as an industry, we do have a couple just raw incentive challenges that we have to fix. For example, if Upwork were to say something that might be hurting their bottom line, even though it might be better for freelancers, companies, you name it. So I will call that out. Alina, is there any burning questions on your mind or things you want to make sure that we hit on?
Yeah, well, it's excellent discussion. Actually, I didn't want to interrupt because you're bringing up so many issues that we heard also throughout the weeks of this event. And particularly last week, we had specific sessions or range of sessions dedicated to European Freelance Week, which is annual movement to support freelancers in Europe. And we actually discussed exactly that, the support of the government, how far we can go with them, who is in there actually to support freelancers, because Europe is so fragmented. We have so many countries which has so many different legislations. And, we have obviously countries who are supporting freelancers quite well, such as Western Europe and maybe Eastern Europe, a little bit Central Europe is still can be shaky in that regard. So there is definitely a lot to be done, and also in terms of protection, insurance, and liabilities, and social security and stuff like that. And I've dropped in the chat manifesto. This is actually the product of European Freelance Week, which outlines the main points that this organization, which is actually run by a nonprofit organization and a couple of partners who are involved, including Freelance Business, to collect as many signatures as possible and move this manifesto forward to policymakers in Europe, so that voices of freelancers could be heard. So that's excellent thing.
Super interesting. So Matt, you mentioned the Freelancers Union. I don't know what happened, to be honest, but there are similar things here in the US. The question is, how do you stay pure, right? Like, how do you stay on the freelancer side? Because to be honest with you all freelancers out there, you're a really tough market in terms of, from an entrepreneur's shoes, it's very hard to make money off of freelancers. No one's yet been able to do it at scale. And so while things like freelancers unions and various unions are cute, just know that that's one of the major challenges is funding is very, very hard. And that's common in technology in the early stages.
Yeah, indeed. Like entire freelance economy, I think it's still so young to run full speed, but I hope, fingers crossed, we'll get to that level pretty much soon. Well, fantastic. I do have questions, but I'm not going to raise them now because we are a bit of over time already. But folks, if you have any specific questions, comments, please connect with both Matthews on LinkedIn. They'll be happy to answer, I guess. And the book, yeah, where can we find that?
Wherever you get your books, wherever you get your books, I will.
But if you like digital's right now. You don't have to wait. We also have an audiobook and a podcast.